In Module 1, you saw just how much employment relationships and industry structures have changed in the last 40 years, the impact those changes have had on working conditions, and how those changes have made enforcing labor standards laws even more difficult. Now, we're going to talk about what to do about all of this. To start, let's get clear on the broader mission of any enforcement agency, which is to achieve widespread compliance with the laws that you enforce. To do this, your agency needs a logic of deterrence. Your logic of deterrence is your agency's strategy to discourage employers from violating the laws. Based on our research and work with agencies across the country, we know that most agencies' logic of deterrence looks a bit like an unending game of whack-a-mole where the agencies try to hit whatever case pops up and like a hamster wheel. This is because agency staff are running as fast as they can to keep up with all the work, but they aren't actually getting anywhere in terms of achieving widespread, sustained compliance. When thinking about logic of deterrence, the puzzle then becomes, how does your agency's day-to-day practices actively discourage employers in high violation industries from violating the law? To understand how best to discourage violations, we have to consider why employers violate the law. So let's take a moment to consider this question. What do you think are the three most common reasons that employers violate the laws that you enforce? If you are taking this course individually, take a couple of minutes to think about your answer and write it down. If you're taking this course in a cohort, please discuss your answers as a group. Now that you've thought about the question of why employers violate, let's return to thinking about our approach to deterrence. Once you have a sense of why employers violate the laws that you enforce, the question that follows are whether the agency has and is using the tools that can effectively address the root cause of the violations. Put another way, are we tailoring enforcement to tackle the underlying drivers of noncompliance? The predominant model for enforcing labor standards laws in the US is the complaint-based model. Under this model, enforcement agencies respond to worker complaints. The rationale behind the model is that workers who experience violations will complain. They'll speak up. If that proved true, then a complaint-based model would make sense. However, research that we and that others have done have repeatedly demonstrated that the complaint-based model alone overlooks workers in some of the highest violation industries. Studies demonstrate that there is little overlap between the sectors with high rates of wage theft and those sectors from which the highest numbers of complaints originate. In other words, an enforcement model that is premised on the assumption that workers will complain when they experience a violation is a model that will not adequately reach workers in some of the most exploitative industries. Here's one way to understand this research. These four quadrants help us to categorize industries using two data points. The first data point is the prevalence of complaints. This is data that we get from agencies. The second data point is the prevalence of violations. This is data that we get from a monthly census survey that asks workers how much they work and how much they're paid. Complaint-based only enforcement means that we are spending most of our resources on the high complaint industries, which fall in quadrants 1 and 3. And because quadrant 2 industries are by definition low complaint, it will be hard to reach workers in these high violation industries using only a complaint-based enforcement model. So by relying exclusively on complaints, agencies overlook some of the highest violation industries in which workers are unwilling or unable to file a complaint. Just so you can see what this study looks like in real life, here is a study that we did for the New Jersey Department of Labor. We did this study so that the agency could see where they're using their resources and in which industries the complaint-based model was not reaching. You'll see industries in which the complaint-based model is working relatively well is food services, personal services, which is an industry that includes occupations like hairdressers, and also textile manufacturing. Workers who are getting left out of the complaint-based model include those workers in private households and the accommodations industry, which is an industry that includes hotels and motels. With all of that in mind, understanding that some workers in high violation industries will fall through the cracks of the complaint-based only enforcement system, the question is, why don't some workers complain? What do you all see in your work? Why don't some workers, especially those workers in high violation industries, complain to your agency? Again, if you are taking this course individually, please take a couple of minutes to think about your answer and write it down. And if you're taking this course in a group, please discuss your answers as a group. Researchers have asked workers why they don't complain. The top two reasons are their fear of being fired and their belief that the claim wouldn't make a difference. They also fear reduced wages or hours, while other workers said they didn't complain because they knew of other workers who had experienced retaliation for asserting workplace rights. These findings help explain barriers that workers face to complaining, and they underscore the importance of strong retaliation protections and enforcement. So, what does all of this mean? The complaint based model of enforcement is inherently reactive. Agencies merely react to the complaints that come in their door. And often, an agency is receiving more complaints than they can effectively handle. This can feel like complaints are stacking up all around you. And the more complaints that come in, the more work that is assigned to investigators, which can then impact the time it takes to investigate any one complaint. Growing caseloads and longer investigation times then incentivize investigators to prioritize the cases that are the easiest to close just to move something off their desk. The problem, of course, is that the easiest cases are often the least impactful. Strategic enforcement is an alternative enforcement model to traditional complaint based enforcement. Rather than reacting to every complaint that is filed, strategic enforcement is a proactive approach in which agencies focus their limited resources with the goal of creating widespread, sustained compliance. Here's another visual to help conceptualize the difference. In a complaint based model, we're just waiting for the waves of complaints to come in, and then we try not to drown. On the other hand, strategic enforcement is like a surfboard for agencies. The goal is not merely to close cases. Instead, strategic enforcement forces us to understand that wage theft and other labor standards violations are so prevalent that widespread compliance can only be achieved if agencies' enforcement actions impact the behavior of employers outside of those employers investigated by the agency. We call these ripple effects. Now that we've reached the end of this module, let's take a moment to review the main concepts that we discussed. First, we talked about the logic of deterrence. Does your agency use a whack-a-mole approach? Or do investigators feel like they're on a hamster wheel, always running to keep up with the work, but never really getting anywhere? We also considered why employers violate labor standards laws and whether our enforcement tools address the root cause of violations. Next, we took a close look at the predominant model of enforcement in the US, and we talked about its underlying challenges. We reviewed how research demonstrates that there is little overlap between the sectors with high rates of noncompliance and those sectors from which the highest rates of complaints come. Research also gave us a window into the reasons why workers in high violation sectors don't complain, with the fear of retaliation being at the top of the list. Finally, we looked at the contrast between the complaint-based approach to enforcement and a strategic approach to enforcement. Your agency can continue to try to keep up with the tsunami of complaints, or it can take a proactive approach to enforcement, taming the waves by focusing limited resources on industries, influential employers, and common non-compliant industry practices to achieve sustained, widespread compliance. I hope you now have a better sense of why strategic enforcement is a more sustainable and effective approach to your work. In our next module, we'll look more specifically at the practices that make up strategic enforcement, and we'll discuss why co-enforcement is an essential component of strategic enforcement.